summer of 1938, a lumberyard clerk from Pennsylvania recruited his two nephews and some of their friends from their Williamsport neighborhood to play baseball in a vacant sandlot. During the first few games, Carl Stoltz experimented with the field dimensions, starting with bases 60 feet apart and placing the mound 40 feet from home plate before moving it back 5 feet. Baseball certainly wasn't new in 1938. In fact, Major League Baseball was at the dawn of what some consider the golden age, with heroes like Lou Gehrig, Joe DiMaggio, Mickey Mantle, and Stan Musial. Big League Baseball was a big deal in 1938, which helps explain how Carl Stoltz came up with the idea for what he called his Little League. Stotts didn't like to see boys arguing on sandlots, and he felt that with adult supervision, baseball could be a great way to teach fair play and teamwork. So after a summer of research and development, he found a dairy, a lumberyard, and a pretzel bakery to sponsor 3 teams, which were coached by 3 volunteers: Carl Stoltz and his friends Bert and George. So on June 6, 1939, 6 days before the Baseball Hall of Fame was established in Cooperstown, New York, and just 3 months before Nazi Germany invaded Poland at the start of World War II, Lundy Lumber defeated Lycoming Dairy 23-8 in the first Little League baseball game. In spite of World War II, Little League Baseball leagues started popping up around Pennsylvania and then spread to New Jersey in 1947. And as the men came home from the European and Pacific theaters, they returned to women who collaborated with them in creating a baby boom, which provided plenty of participants for Little League Baseball, which had grown to 3,300 leagues by 1954 and had expanded to all 48 states by 1955. A few years later, in events that demonstrate both the power of sport to unite us and the human ability to forgive, a team from West Berlin was the first from Europe to compete in the Little League World Series in 1960, and a team from Tokyo was the first team from Asia to win the Little League World Series in 1967. But presumably there were no teams dreaming of Williamsport on the other side of the Berlin Wall. And the Cold War era geopolitical situation provides one way of understanding the history of youth sport programs around the world. Little League Baseball became the template for organized sport programs in the United States and what I call the first world Little League model of youth sport. And this is in spite of the fact that Little League Baseball certainly wasn't the first adult organized youth sport program in the United States. Basketball had already spread quickly around the United States and around the world through the Young Men's Christian Association, or the YMCA, after basketball was invented by a Canadian who worked in Springfield, Massachusetts at the YMCA Training Center named James Naismith in 1891. And a decade before the first Little League game was played, an organization was formed in response to some teenagers in Philadelphia who spent their time throwing rocks at the windows of a newly built factory. And they apparently had pretty good aim, breaking over 100 windows in 1 month. A friend of the factory owner, Joe Tomlin, came up with a solution. So in 1929, Joe Tomlin met with the owners of the other local businesses, and because summer was turning to autumn, he got them to sponsor a 4-team football league, which would keep the kids busy playing football instead of breaking expensive panes of glass. On a particularly cold April day in 1934, Joe Tomlin held a football clinic for his league, but only one coach showed up, a local legend named Pop Warner. Those in attendance were so appreciative of his appearance that they decided to name the league after him. This prestigious name helped Pop Warner football grow quickly, and on December 27, 1947, Palumbo's Supper Club from Philadelphia beat a team from New York, Frank Sinatra's Cyclone, to win the Santa Claus Bowl 6-0. But for whatever reason, whether it was Carl Stoltz's enthusiasm, a perception that tackle football was just too dangerous for boys to play, or the fact that baseball had already been established as America's pastime, Little League, though created a decade later, grew more quickly than Pop Warner football in participation during the 1950s and expanded much faster and went further internationally. But notice the similarities. Both leagues were created by average Joes, one of whom was actually named Joe, who looked at kids and saw a need and then found a way to meet those needs through sport. Neither league was created in order to develop the talents of young baseball or football players. They were created as youth development programs. Carl Stotz used baseball because he liked baseball, and the kids liked to play baseball. Joe Tomlin used football simply because when he came up with the idea, it was coming to fall, and football was a fall sport. The sport wasn't the most important thing, the children were the most important thing. And the goal of each organization was to create as many leagues as possible and as many teams as possible to accommodate as many boys as possible. Sure, kids presumably dreamed of growing up and playing in the big leagues, but from an adult perspective, participation was the point of Little League, at least at first. Providing opportunities for so many boys required the generosity of an equal number of adults. So both men did what they needed to do to realize their visions, namely recruit adult volunteers and find sponsors who could provide the resources that teams needed to compete in an organized league. So the first world Little League model of organized sport is a story of democracy and capitalism at work. Because Stotz and Tomlin lived in a free society with minimal bureaucracy, they didn't face a lot of obstacles or need to grovel at the feet of some local politician for permission to help kids in their neighborhoods. All they had to do was recruit volunteer labor and find business owners who either believed in their vision or had a financial interest in seeing that it came to pass. Little League and Pop Warner spread because they were based on ideas that resonated with parents who served as volunteers and sponsors who were willing to support the boys. And of course the boys wanted to play baseball and they wanted to play football. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Berlin Wall, post-World War II youth sport was growing as well, which was encouraged by communist leaders who wanted to build a healthy population in order to reduce worker absenteeism, maintain military readiness, and increasingly to develop athletes who could demonstrate the superiority of the Soviet system on an international stage. But rather than bottom-up leagues spreading around the USSR, organized youth sport training was controlled by a massive closed-loop government bureaucracy set in place to train superior athletes. After Stalin's rise to power in Russia, centers for the study of sport and physical culture, staffed by former athletes trained as sports scientists, were established to develop the next generation of superstar athletes out of a relatively small pool of children who had been identified as unusually talented at an early age. And former elite athletes who received graduate training in the sports sciences were assigned to jobs as coaches and trainers. And this helped create what I call the second world or sport academy model of youth sport. And we see the descendants of the Soviet model today not only in the residential gymnastic academies that train the next generation of young gymnasts in China, but also throughout Europe as football clubs have developed intensive training programs for their younger players who either reside at the academy or stay at home with their parents. Some sport academies provide fantastic academic training and send students to Ivy League schools, while others shield adolescents from the needless distractions of reading, writing, and arithmetic. And although the academy model seems to have roots in the Soviet system, you'll now find residential and non-residential sport academies all over the world. Soccer academies in Ghana, distance running academies in Kenya, baseball academies in the Dominican Republic, tennis academies in Florida and California. I had a chance to visit a residential soccer academy in South Africa that, in addition to international standard training, provided an excellent education as well as character education that seemed to be working. The adolescents I interacted with were some of the most polite I've ever met. But although these academies are often established as pathways to a better life, academy life can be challenging socially. Think about it. You're training with people who all want what you want, one of the precious few roster spots or tournament draws at the next level. So with intense competition being a way of life, maintaining friendships can be a challenge that is exacerbated by the fact that adolescents at residential academies are sometimes a long way from home and family, sacrifices that some choose and others have no choice but make. The Second World Sport Academy model seems to have its philosophical roots in the Soviet system, where nomenklatura insiders would make decisions for the good of the people because, as loyal Communist Party members, they at least theoretically knew what was best for the people. And sometimes they decided it would be best for a particular child to leave his home and devote his life to hockey. Players were often chosen from the poorer classes, so although they weren't forced into academies, they may not have had much of a choice. The life stories of Soviet-era Red Army hockey players seemed to be almost interchangeable. Each was among a small number of boys who were selected at a young age based on signs of athletic talent. And as a group, they were put through intensive training under the watchful eye of a dictatorial coach whose task was to mold a team that would dominate on the international stage. But when the Red Army team met their US counterparts in the Olympic semifinal that came to be called the Miracle on Ice, the life stories of their American opponents were quite different. For most of the US players, their stories went something like this. Their parents signed them up for hockey near their home in Minnesota or Michigan or Massachusetts, and they showed greater talent than most of the peers at each level of youth hockey, squirts, peewees, and bantams. So they made their high school varsity hockey team and caught the attention of college scouts who offered them scholarships to play hockey at places like the University of Minnesota and Boston College. And they excelled at the college level and caught the eye of Herb Brooks, who asked that they be invited to try out for the US Olympic hockey team. The First World Little League model grew in the soil of democracy and capitalism and reflects the core values of these philosophies: freedom, liberty, and for boys at least, equal opportunity to participate and to compete at the highest levels that their abilities would allow. But notice that both models, the First World Little League model and the Second World Sport Academy model, each produced some amazingly talented athletes. The Miracle on Ice was considered miraculous because the Soviet team, who had grown up together, was really, really good. But the US players, many of whom didn't even meet each other until college or until US team tryouts, were good enough to defeat the Soviets on that day. So each model has its virtues and each model has its vices, and our own political ideologies may influence our feelings about each model. When I was teaching tennis in the Seattle area a few years ago, I taught 2 Russian children whose families had recently moved to the United States. The dad would attend practices regularly and liked to talk about tennis, and he liked to talk about his kids and our strange ways of doing youth sport in the US. He explained that in Russia, they take a group of kids and make them champions and don't spread themselves too thin with too many kids. He seemed to believe that the academy model was the most effective way to develop expertise, and on a deeper, more philosophical level, he seemed to be more sympathetic to the underlying values upon which the academy model was built, rather than the participation for all, may the best man win values of the First World Little League model. But the First World Little League model and the Second World Sport Academy model are not the only ways of doing youth sport. About 8 years ago, I traveled to Uganda to see the world. And one of the things I saw was boys playing soccer everywhere. Anywhere there was a patch of dirt or a patch of grass, you'd see boys playing soccer after school. but rarely were they playing with a leather soccer ball. Instead, they improvised with banana fiber or dirty plastic bags that they wound into the shape of a soccer ball. But what amazed me was the foot skills of some of these kids. They didn't have any coaching or adult involvement, but they would meet up in the same spot each day, play keep away for a few minutes, then stack a few rocks to create goals, divide themselves into teams, and play, spending equal time scoring goals and celebrating each goal scored in ways that were suspiciously reminiscent of Premier League celebrations. This may sound familiar, and it's what we call sandlot play in the US. But many kids living in more affluent suburban areas of the United States are so overscheduled that these children and adolescents may not have much experience with free play. But in the absence of adult organized youth sport, this is how children play. And in developing nations where youth sport infrastructures are not well developed, what I call the third world free play model of youth sport is still the dominant way in which talent is developed, at least before adolescence. The third world free play model didn't emerge from a political ideology, but grew out of the reality that organized sport only exists in places where adults have organized youth sport. The first world Little League model requires a great deal of adult involvement and an army of parents who are willing to volunteer their time to drive their children to practices and competitions, and sometimes to serve as coaches, officials, and administrators. And the second world academy model usually requires that resources be provided by a government, school, or NGO for a sport academy to be created. I've had the privilege to travel a lot over the past few years and to learn from and meet with coaches and administrators and bureaucrats in North America and South America and Africa and Asia. And one of the questions that many of the leaders at the highest levels are grappling with is this: what sort of youth sport model is best for our country? And they grapple with the reality that what is best depends on the objectives that haven't always been clearly articulated. Are we trying to develop the talents of a few at the expense of any other social benefit? Are we trying to use sport as a vehicle for social change? Are we trying to balance these objectives? Or do we want something else entirely? Each model, the first world Little League model, the second world Sport Academy model, and the third world free play model, has its virtues and its vices, and some of the strengths and limitations of each are easy to see. But I think that asking which is best is a bit of a trick question, and that is one of my favorite topics to discuss with sport leaders around the world.